evening. First things first, if you could just please click your phone off, disconnect it. It's a pleasure to host this evening's event in the public program. Welcome everybody to an event titled Spielraum. It's my best German I could do it.
It's good. Man, it's pretty good.
The making of, which is really a conversation with everyone involved in the making of a fantastic book that I'm sure everybody here has seen and that is available behind us all evening from the bookshop. A book that you could say is probably one-third part monograph, one-third part test panel, and one-third part architectural model combined together in book-like form. And I say that because it's an incredibly interesting book to have a conversation this evening around the relationship between architectural books and the architects and or offices and studios that they represent, and the presence of many different kinds of thinking within these volumes. And we are joined this evening by contributors of all sorts with this particular book. Spielraum, which was published by Hal Foster and came out recently in 2014, includes a number of essays, and I won't say too much about the book form itself because that'll be the point of a couple of brief presentations as we begin this evening. But Spielraum is described by Hal Foster this way. Hal Foster is one of the contributors in the essays in this book. He says, in the end, Barkow Leibinger are bricoleurs as much as they are engineers. There is always an element of inspired performance in the bricolage. And as the greatest German philosophers in aesthetics tell us, such play, or Spiel, is also essential to art. It opens up a realm for an imaginative response to any question. In the end, this is what Barkow Leibinger offer us all. Spielraum, room for play, space for invention. It is a book that is organized around 5 thematic fields: fabrication/research, liminal facade/deep surface, ultra-structural, makeover, and finally site-specific. And this comprehensive monograph presents the work of the Berlin-based German-American architectural practice Barkow Leibinger, with contributions by Hal Foster, Carson Chan, who's one of our guests this evening, Sarah Whiting, who many of you know as a visitor every year in our external examination, myself, and the photographer Iwan Bond. We have a number of topics we've kind of set up as the basis for a roundtable discussion. I'm going to try and moderate that in a way in which you all are going to be encouraged to join in the points as they're raised. I thought, just very briefly before handing it over to Zak to talk about the making of the book, I would just introduce everybody here at the table involved. Frank Barkow, opposite me, studied architecture at Montana State University and at Harvard University. From 1993, with Regine Leibinger, formed a practice in Berlin, has been a visiting professor at Cornell University, Harvard University, and was a unit master here not so long ago. In an end-of-year exhibition I can remember that featured rusty metal panels out on the sidewalk, actually, as part of an end-of-year show.
Yeah.
Terrific piece, actually, which most of our guests missed entirely as they walked into the building. A terrific piece. His partner, Regine Leibinger, studied architecture in Berlin and at Harvard University. From 1993, formed the practice, as I said, with Frank, where they are still working and headquartered in Berlin. Has been a visiting professor as well here and at Cornell University, Harvard University, and since 2006, professor for building construction and design at the TU Technische Universita in Berlin. So again, that's the limit of my German. I'm not going to push this. Carson Chan, opposite me, is an architecture writer and curator. He has worked for Barkow Leibinger Architects and the Neue National Gallery's Architecture Exhibitions Department in Berlin, and he's the co-founder of Program, a non-commercial initiative for art and architecture collaborations, and a contributing editor at Kaleidoscope and an editor-at-large at a fantastic journal that you all know, a magazine called 032C in Berlin. Zak Kyes, to my left, you all already know, is a London-based graphic designer and art director. He founded the Zak Group in 2005, and since 2006 has been with us here at the AA as our art director, and amongst other things here at the AA, co-founded our publishing imprint within AA Publications called Bedford Press, and has worked with Frank and Regina and everyone on 2 previous publications, which I think he'll say something about in his presentation, that you could say were the beta and version 1 editions of ideas that came together in the book we'll look at tonight. And people are going to do just a very brief introduction, and we're going to begin it with Zak, who will talk a bit about the making of the book and lead us toward a conversation.
Great, thank you. So it's really a pleasure to be here tonight with Frank and Regina and their team to celebrate the launch of Spielraum. The book, which I will speak about a little bit, marks about 20 years, I believe, of their practice. But what I would really like to focus on in my kind of short 10-minute presentation is our collaboration, the collaboration between my studio Zak Group and Barkow Leibinger. So that's something that began about, I think, in late 2011, and was really, over the years, has been a way in which we've helped give shape, I guess, to the office's architectural ideas. And those have taken different forms. We've worked on several books together. The book that we're launching tonight is the 3rd book that we've worked on. And I'll speak about making this book, but before that I would like to speak about the kind of background of our collaboration. So this is just, prior to working on the publication, we worked together on the kind of visual identity of the office, and this is one of these working sessions in their office in Berlin. So when we began to work on an identity for Barkow Leibinger, the kind of question was really to explore how the identity could be really in line with the kind of conceptual approach of the office. And so before proposing a new identity, we looked at how Barkow Leibinger have presented themselves in the past, and also how different architectural practices and collectives have represented themselves, and the different types of names that they give themselves. One of the kind of initial decisions immediately, I think in the first meeting, was to eliminate architecture from Barkow Leibinger. So that was done in the first meeting. And the name of the practice always existed in English and in German, and so we kind of dropped that descriptive element, and it's now simply Barkow Leibinger. In one of the first workshops that we held, in which Barkow Leibinger presented their practice to me, they included this slide in their presentation. And I thought it's very simple, but I thought it was very telling, that it works as a kind of explanation of their practice, almost like a logo. It triangulates their activities between research, the academy, and practice. So when starting to speculate on a new identity, what became clear is that these kind of nodes are very important in understanding the practice. And we also discovered that in addition to these nodes, there could be others like master plan and building, or prototype and installations, fabrication and materiality, and so forth. So we kind of proposed that the practice is really defined by these connections, and started to formulate a kind of graphic approach based on that observation. We looked at different kind of graphic representations of connections, and started with a very kind of simple line, which can connect different words. And I think if there's ever been evidence that architects desperately want to be graphic designers, this is really the proof of it. These are Frank's doodles of the identity that we proposed, which eventually took this form. So it's a line that kind of couples and links and joins, and also spans different scales and approaches. So that's part of all of the kind of stationary material. The line can either be a set width, or it can scale. and accommodate different formats. So we've worked on, I guess, many different things, from kind of internal documents to publications. We even made a chocolate bar together after noticing that the startling resemblance of the Tour Total facade panels to a chocolate bar. In 2013, we began working on the book that we'll be discussing tonight, and where I think that quite often graphic designers are approached with a kind of fully formed idea of a book in mind. This collaboration was different in the sense that we had already worked together. There was an idea to make a book. We had made books before, but the kind of formation of the content and the form was really kind of done in parallel as a kind of joint project. Spielraum falls into the category of a monograph, and we looked at different types of monographs. So a monograph allows for a kind of stronger editorial role than a complete works. And monographs, of course, typically group content either chronologically or by typology. So we felt that, you know, these models have been kind of well tried, and we wanted to try to use a different model, knowing that the archive already kind of exists online. So we proposed a kind of structure for the book in which there would be different layers that could be kind of clusters of content. Some of these clusters could include essays and others not. The clusters could be kind of as long or as short as necessary. And when doing that, we actually referred back to these two publications that we worked on previously, the two atlas books published by AA Publications, which really emphasize through a very kind of robust, simple grid, the kind of materiality and the research that goes on in the office. So here you can see a few pages from these books, which kind of simply present images and text kind of interchangeably. When working on Spielraum, we kind of translated this idea into a kind of system which could accommodate very rough research material, snapshots, but also technical drawings and final photographs. And so what I think this does is kind of create interesting proximities and connections, which I think some of the other speakers will also talk about. Who should I hand it over to? Frank?
Some of these images will be redundant, so let me kind of cut through this. I mean, there was two aspects. I mean, one, the idea of the book as a kind of construct. Again, there's something completely arbitrary of taking a sort of swath of your practice in terms of time and trying to compress that into a book. So that was one aspect, and I think the other aspect really is the content, which Brett and Carson can talk about also. But obviously it was about statistics, about the time it took to make it, the size of it, the kind of editing, how many projects would use, the number of images, who photographed this thing, and in early stages there was this kind of sorting around, trying to identify projects, try to make sense of them, try to, in a way, not categorize them, but at the same time it is a book that's shifting from a kind of process-oriented, which the earlier atlases were really about, to a kind of project content. And I think Brett talks about in his essay the relationship between projects, which isn't always obvious, but there is a kind of communication between these things. So in a way we were trying to sort through these kinds of diagrams about how these things might collect, and in a way we sort of immersed ourselves in this material. We literally plastered the walls of the studio with different projects and tried to begin to make relationships between these things. There is constantly a process of editing things out, editing things in, making relationships between these things. in a practice that's quite diverse, from, say, fabrication research to installations to project-based things, and this sort of shuffling in and out of these kinds of projects. At the same time, I think fairly on with Zak, we started to mock pages up to show relationships. Again, we weren't starting from zero in the sense that we had done the earlier projects, that we could start to use that as a kind of template. There were other kinds of projects that we were doing at the same time. This was an application project where we created a kind of collection of new books, old books, in a kind of folio format. And then, in a way, collecting writers for the project. So, this had a certain sense of open-endedness. The writers we knew were very familiar with our work, but we didn't prescribe what they would write, but simply presented our work to them, and then allowed them to write what they wanted to about our work. So Carson's is more oriented in context. Hal was this idea of instruments, Sarah on the idea of the ceiling as a kind of tectonic idea, and Brett's on the architectural thinking. So at the same time, other sort of players in the process, photographers, some new, some old, and then a photographer like Ivan Bahn, who we asked to come down and photograph our campus in Stuttgart-Dinsigen, where in a way this acts as a kind of essay also. So in a way, this is sort of representing our own work back to us through a dizzying sort of array of many, many photographs that he did over a course of a few days that we then were able to select. As Zak pointed out, we finally did limit it to a number of sort of categories where we could start to drop projects in, shuffle projects in and out that started to, and again, this whole process took 3 years, so it didn't happen overnight, but there was this effort to sort of coalesce some of these ideas in a coherent way. There were long discussions about things like covers, which I think is still going on to this day. This was sort of the first cut. We ended up doing a short cut, and in the end, we selected, I think, 2 covers. These are proof prints, but 2 covers, one a kind of limited edition, and then a kind of more general cover for it. So this is actually the project of looking at proofs of color representations of the project, selecting finally a cover that, again, still, I think for us represents this idea of process and the idea of the physicality of the model making that we make, the relationship between these things, and the kind of range between this kind of the more experimental work to the kind of building project that we're doing. So these are the final covers that we produced and then went in to production. The other aspect, as I mentioned, was this idea of content. The essays in the process were in a way integrated between the different work areas of the project, which again, fabrication, research, which is a kind of primal one in terms of all projects are somehow underpinned by this kind of thinking, the experimental work, the more physical material work that we do, and a kind of representation. So even though the project, the book is full of many, many projects, there were an aspect of other kinds of projects which aren't simply experimentation, that work at different scales, say exhibition scale or a kind of installation scale, which are also peppered through the book. Carson was sort of, we've kind of grown up together in Berlin, was a huge asset, I think, in the process, because he was able to sort of give that perspective of what it's meant to have a Berlin-based practice, what it's meant to operate there, as well as in other places where Marrakesh, which he curated, we were part of that, and the project we did in Korea. So there's a possibility for you to look very closely at the Berlin condition, and at the same time to think about projects elsewhere and how we reacted to it. Sarah was able to write a very specific article on the idea of structure, particularly the idea of the ceiling as a kind of structural idea that reappears in several of our projects. So the luxury of having so many fantastic writers, I think, was, in this case, the possibility to really focus in on a very specific topic that was of interest to her, including literally dropping projects in like this pavilion in Berlin, which I think we dropped it in the book like a few minutes before the final deadline for presenting. So the book was this incredibly dynamic thing of some projects which were quite old, which other projects that had been literally finished just a few days before we were able to go to print. So thanks for that, guys. As well as other topics, Brett, again, who is known as probably the longest, was able to write a very fantastic article that also overlapped with our work, as well as I think what you guys were doing down in Venice with your project for the Domino House. So I think in a way the timing really tied together in a really nice way in terms of what we've been doing and some of the things you guys have been doing over here. So again, make over a chapter looking at restoration as another area that we continue to work with. And then Ivan Bond's project, which works as kind of inset in the book of a whole catalog of his photographs, either flying around in drones or helicopters, which he likes to do, or getting on the ground and seeing actually the kind of workings of this evolving factory campus that he could look at. Site-specific being a kind of obvious one, again, particularly for our projects in Berlin, which have to do, particularly in the beginning, with these kinds of histories of working in the periphery, like our Biosphere project, not in the center, and how those kinds of sites and landscapes could affect our projects, as well as the project I mentioned where Carson curated the Loom Hyperbolic project in Marrakesh, to more recent projects such as the Estrel Tower complex in Neukölln in the periphery of Berlin. And I think that's the last image. I think we overlapped a little bit, Zak, but that was in a way our thinking in terms of putting the book together again as a kind of construct.
Yes, Carson.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And it's true that I worked for you guys, and it was actually the reason why I moved to Berlin in the first place. But before I started working for you guys, I also had you as a professor at Cornell for a semester. So it spans, I don't know, more than it's like 14 years, maybe no, a bit less. And it's been kind of iterated already, and with these kind of categories that you guys have made for the book, your kind of emphasis on material, fabrication, technology, forms, and I think it's kind of trodden territory in terms of talking about Barkow Leibinger architects. You guys have had an exhibition here about that specific topic and your engagement in that. So what I wanted to do was to kind of write a text about what I found was a kind of another aspect of the work, which was kind of a certain kind of sensibility, either wittingly or unwittingly, that you guys have developed, in my eyes, about context and content. And I remember one of the things that you had us do at Cornell was to look at Robert Smithson, the idea of the site non-site dialectic, which today seems kind of a really kind of prescient exercise that we did. The question of how one develops sensitivity towards site, I guess in a world where context and regional specificity is diffused by travel and instant communication, becomes all the more kind of like an urgent question. So this kind of insistence on concept and site is something that I began with in terms of trying to explicate your work, not through technology, not through form making, not through fabrication. So as maybe just the image before, we can see the Marrakesh biennial. And so when in 2012, when Nadim Saman and I curated the Marrakesh biennial, we wanted to find a way to engage the local people in a non-verbal way. So Marrakesh is an extremely multilingual place, and the majority of the people there have had no kind of access to contemporary art. So we wanted this kind of like physical material interaction, and immediately I thought of you guys, this kind of combination of this latent understanding of context, but foregrounding of form making, I thought would be really engaging. And so the text is basically a rereading of a lot of your other projects through my reading of how you guys engaged with Marrakesh. Just a little bit of background. So the idea of public art doesn't really exist in the history of contemporary Moroccan art exhibition. And also the history of weaving is interesting. So Morocco, as you know, was a French protectorate since 1912, and traditional crafts like weaving and ceramics were co-opted to become kind of state production for the French state, rather. And so I thought this would be, so the fact that they used weaving as a way to re-engage the public and kind of like redefine what weaving means in a very physical and non-verbal way, I thought was kind of had a certain sensibility towards the context. The True Tech building in Korea, again, is often kind of talked about in terms of the way it deals with the facade and form and the development of that form. But what I saw was kind of really interesting is that it was built on reclaimed land in an area that was called the Digital Media Zone or something like that. But so this was going to be, this area of Seoul was going to be the center of the new digital revolution there, the kind of like the in-house Silicon Valley that they would develop for themselves. And the way that the building is made up of this crystalline facade, made up of mirrors that reflects from, in every which way, I claim, makes the building's presence is its surroundings fragmentation. So kind of like inverting the relationship in that way. And lastly, if we were to look at the Tour Total kind of through the site sensibility as with Marrakesh, I read the Tour Total, and do you have an image of the Tour Total? Sorry.
Yeah.
I should have prepared images. I read the Tour Total kind of as the last chapter in Berlin's ideological manifestations articulated through architecture. So, as many of you probably know already, the Hanseviertel in Tiergarten in Berlin, built in 1957, was West Berlin's urban response to kind of East Berlin's Dahlenallee as a kind of urban gesture. And when West German media giant Axel Springer built their headquarters right next to the Berlin Wall in 1966, and it had this kind of giant billboard on the top, kind of like symbolizing free press, projected to East Berlin. The East Berlin government built a series of apartment buildings exactly the same height as the Axel Springer building, covering it effectively from view. So the Tour Total, I argue, is located perfectly to add to the citywide conversation through architecture. And it is located in a zone right now slated for new development, and the evolution of which will determine the city's current architectural fingerprint. It's the first thing one sees coming out of the main train station. It still is, and it's the tallest building there, and I think it will remain the tallest building there for a little while.
Yeah.
But there's nothing taller built next to it,
No.
right? Or- yeah.
No, in front of it maybe, but it's probably
Well,
nothing.
Future.
There goes my argument for that.
No,
and-
it won't happen.
Right, it won't happen. And symbolically, and I guess also unwittingly,
Or bad.
the Tour Total sits right at the tip of the grand axis that Albert Speer designed for Hitler's new vision of Berlin as the center of the world. So where the building is now is actually the tip of the axis for Germania, coincidentally. So the view from the building, from here, the Berlin that we see today from this vantage point uniquely shows us what the city did not build as a positive reminder and a measure of what it could be. So in this way, kind of re-looking at all these projects, not through technology, not through fabrication, not through material, but through its kind of development within a context, I think allows for a deeper, richer reading of Barkow Leibinger's work.
Terrific. Regine, would you like to say something? Would you like to speak by not speaking or speak by saying something?
I'll speak
about
when
the-
you'll ask me something.
Okay. No, thank you for those introductions. Terrific. Several points that would be a way to start the conversation. I think, firstly, and I think it was Zak that mentioned this, that the practice is 20 years old. Is that right?
21.
Which we met the year, I guess, that you all formed the office, which I did not know. And one of the staggering things about friendships is that other people end up telling you about them, the facts of their origins, which is amazing. So 20 years, major monograph comes together. And would it be right to say that architectural monographs are the midlife crisis of the profession? Like, it is a phenomenal rule of architectural life that 20 years of work results in a big volume of stuff.
Yeah.
1994 is the year SML XL comes out, 20 years after that office is founded, famously.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of an example like Mies. Mies is probably an exception because it takes him 40 years, famously in 1940, but that's 2 times 20, so he was just a slow, steady person to get there. And I think there is something to it being a kind of pause, a kind of reconnoitering of where we're going in life and what's happening. And I guess the first question would be something around what has it done for you in terms of the way you're leading and shaping the office in either the collaboration with the people that have helped shape this book, or how you all as a practice have sort of rethought not just your identity in the straightforward sense, but also how you understand your world. Like the short version of the question is, what do you know now that you didn't know when you didn't have the book? Or are there things actually?
Did you feel like making the book definitely felt like a midlife crisis. I mean, I never said the midlife before that because I refused to have a midlife crisis. Frank had one for a very long time. So this is
well done.
So it's more. It's more, but it feels definitely. It doesn't feel like a crisis, but it feels.
Sure.
It took 3 years, and it didn't take 3 years for nothing because it's incredibly hard to do it. And first you have the question, should you do it at all? And now in the digital world, why should you do it at all? Because at the same time we were doing a website, and you can basically find everything on our website as well, right? Not your texts, of course, but the images are there, and you can read through chronologically through the whole story and everything. And that was one question that I had, or that I kept asking. And then the crisis of what do you put in, what don't you put in? And then this thing would happen at the very end, which completely. We just finished a project for the American Academy in Berlin, which is a beautiful little pavilion, which is this one project that you dropped in the very last minute at the printer, and I was so happy for that. But that's I think that's very typical for making a book, because there's never. Maybe the beginning is easier to define than the end, because of course you're constantly in process. You're producing projects while you're doing the book. So where do you stop, and what don't you put in? I mean, and we somehow came to, and I think when we did the first monograph, which we did in the 90s, after 5 or 8 years, that was certainly way too early. I mean, looking back at that was way too early. And at that point, we made this huge mistake that we had a ton of construction site photos in there, which you would never do anymore. So you learn, that's like looking at that back, we learned from that. But now, it just felt, we have a lot of projects in there that also go 20 years back. And, but why I really enjoy doing it at the end, and why I'm really happy with it, is that it makes you really rethink your work. And in our case, it makes so much sense what we did. And it's so beautiful to look back and see that projects we did 20 years ago totally matter and completely are really legible and make total sense, and it's not only about process, it's really a clear continuation. So a project in Switzerland, where it's this beautiful folded facade in Bar, it's a factory we did, has a lot to do with Korea. That's 15 years later, and Total has a lot to do with that again, you know. So it's like you would really use this word leitmotif. There's a lot of leitmotifs, like things like red lines that lead through our work, and that come beautifully together in that book, and which allows that book to really it's really everything, but it's not a coffee table book, which is really nice. It's really almost like a encyclopedia. It's like a dictionary in a way, you know,
The atlas
which is like the atlas, yeah. And I said before, had we not done the atlases, I don't think we would have been able to think that way. And so so it doesn't feel like a midlife crisis, more in the sense of where do you stop, and did you stop at the right point? Yeah. But I think we did. We have fantastic texts in there, and we have this amazing graphic in there. And I'm a big fan of words and graphic, and it's beautiful how the graphic is actually ordering the book. You know, we didn't have to come. So and that makes a lot of sense again for the work. I mean, of the office, because it's like a tool. The graphic becomes like a tool organizing the book, and that was really powerful.
Mm.
So and then again a clear collaboration, which also speaks a lot for our office. There's two is already a lot, and in order to make these two work together, you need other people to smooth it out, which are these two over there too.
These guys, but the crisis I thought was, somehow the idea of collecting all these things and almost it doesn't feel like our project really. Somehow it's already a historical project, right? So somebody else's job. So in a way, it's the job of historians or theorists to write about it. So, as practitioners, the thing we're interested in is the thing we're working on right now. So, in a way, I tried to collapse it into maybe a 5-year, not look back 20 years, but look in the last 5 years. So there was something about an obligation, about having to compress all this stuff. It's interesting. It shows the agility of the practice. You can do this, you can do that. It shows a kind of evolution in the work. But I think what Regine was saying, the positive aspect of doing that is reflecting. I think it does help set up, the next 20 years. So what do you do? What's important? What are the characters, their traits? What's the DNA of a practice that makes it what it is? And how do you tag into that?
I wonder, because Regina was saying how it tied a lot of things together, but did it, in the process that you guys went through, did it trouble anything about the practice as well?
Well, there's not everything in there.
Yes.
We dropped some projects too.
I'm always interested in what doesn't make it. Like, that's another way to think of what you've learned, actually, stuff that you just don't want to,
What
that just
doesn't
didn't
make-
contribute to either how you
Well,
relate to the
it's a
project.
different kind of production. We have friends who are writers, and they write one novel every 8 years. We're in a European-based competition, practicing European. You produce a lot of shit.
Yeah.
Some of it's fantastic, some of it's not. But you're producing and producing and producing. So I think editing really is about showing a critical path. But we don't. I don't know. Tom, we could talk about this, but practices, Swiss practices, other practices where it's a very, very precise, what do you do next? And I think...
Yeah, but what doesn't make it is clearly the stuff that you haven't worked hard enough on. The quick competitions don't make it, I think, seriously.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Quick studies, quick research project make it. Where it's a one-to-one model that comes up quickly in the Werkstatt, in the shop. But I think quick competitions didn't make it. Compromises didn't make it. Like we did somehow at some point through the Tour Total, through this high rise, we landed in Berlin, and then all of a sudden we got invited to a lot of competitions there, and we did some of them just because we were invited, because we wanted to finally land in the city, and we did the best we could, but we did the work was compromised, and that stuff is then of course dropped out, and that's not strong enough to survive. But I think that's normal for a practice. Like Frank says, you have to you come bombarded with. If you at a certain level, when you're sort of successful in Germany, you get really. You get invited constantly to these competitions, and you have to do them in order to be alive. Or be visible on the market. But yeah, and that's something you start thinking about, especially after 20 years. And when you have other things that you could do, do you want to continue that, or are you going back to the Zumtor or to this whatever, or to another model where you do one nice project? He doesn't do that anymore, but he said that for a while. When there's they really select their work and they do 1 or 2 nice projects per year, but that's of course being discussed and being thought of, but that's also naive in a way.
one reason I like the question, I like asking people around, exceptional projects like this, is because it's also a way to ground the question of what do you mean by how the book has been edited and constructed. That's one of those, that decision about what's included and what isn't is an editorial one more than anything, and not simply a qualitative. And one reason I'm so interested in the relationship between architectural books and their practices is that one of the peculiarities of modern architecture was that it was a form of architectural pursuit that was invented first by editors. It wasn't that a bunch of work was done, a bunch of editors wrote history for it. The pioneers of the modern movement in your city a century ago were minds like Mises, who edits briefly a journal that has a transformational impact on his, like Le Corbusier famously, editing his Oeuvre Complet from the very beginning. Gropius does the same with his books program, again in Germany. And one of the startling features of modern architecture is that the industrially printed text is a fundamental dimension to the architectural project. Stuff spreads out, it communicates quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
Those two things really grow and rise throughout the 20th century. And that's why I find this editorial question so interesting a century later. It's still there, arguably.
Let's go back to Mies. I mean, if you go back to Mies's, Philip Johnson's catalog he did for MoMA in 30, all of the early work, all the early villas drop out.
Gone.
They're gone. They don't exist. So in a way, he's presenting himself, but he's very much framing it at that time into a relatively thin slice of activity, and rather than saying, well, whereas a historian would actually say, well, look, if you look at the Perros Villa, you will find this and this, which is fully realized through this. But he's not really interested in illustrating that process, but somehow it's a very precise slice of it that is what he uses as a kind of launch into that whole next era, which becomes a kind of US project when he goes to IIT. So he's very calculating all along the way. So I think, I don't know if our editing is that devious, but again, I think there is a critical path, and I think some projects are more invested, and those are the ones that you want to somehow illustrate or display as the kind of points, again, along a kind of chronology. So if the earlier atlases, were a bit evasive about not showing projects, but simply showing techniques, in a way, you kind of have to force your hand here to show you kind of at least say or determine what were the critical points along that chronology.
But of course you have to think about the market at the same time, and you have to think about the marketing of your office also. So we had these discussions. Frank and Kathleen over here from our office, they had the discussion that she wanted to get some projects in that where we could send out for applications, or would be more client friendly. Well, Frank was much more radical at the very beginning. The atlases are very radical. I think. And so with the book, and also you have a publishing company behind you, Hatikans, they have a clear, idea about selling this book. So it needs to sell. Thank God it's selling very well. But, so you have to sort of please a lot of different minds and people. You were involved quite a lot into that, and with the select. We had some long sessions sometimes where we,
I think probably the critical path was one of the things that took the most time, really. And one of the things that was also cut would be different types of groupings of content.
Yeah.
Like what you see now, like liminal facade and different categories, those came up after quite a lot of kind of debate and discussion, and I think there were other categories that were kind of eliminated completely because it didn't seem that had the same importance in the practice's thinking. So,
did one of you mention that you were also working on a website at the same time? And I guess the question would be,
right?
What's the relationship between the book as a project and, let's say, its online representation of BL and the office? And
well, if
was there a deliberate attempt to differentiate and distinguish?
Yeah, I would still say,
to make one the other.
If the marketing aspects over here and having identifying what your project is, the more critical aspect is over here. I would say office brochures over here, websites maybe somewhere here, and the monographs over here. So I think you have to.
The atlas kind of way up there.
But I think you need to distinguish between those, because I think you can't wear all those hats. I don't think you can make don't think you can aim it at every target, you know, like
Yeah.
a category like the idea of facades being liminal is not a marketing strategy, you know? It's a technique that characterizes a body of work. So in a way, you know, we can't do both of those things. You know, it can fall into conversations about performance or sustainability or economics. I mean, all those things are valid, but I think it needs a certain autonomy within that overall practice. So I think you kind of, Zach, you may not agree, but again, I think there's different calibrations across that spectrum from, you know, what is this thing, what is this thing, what is this thing?
But I think you could even, push that a little bit further and radicalize that kind of difference, So if the book is a way, kind of like a self-representation that's accurate to how you want to be, perceived rather than purely a marketing tool, why not, see the book as also a site for experimentation? So in a way, what you guys were doing with the Atlas, but like the Smart Material House, I've always found that to be so evocative as a kind of project. The way that these kind of hollow, lightweight concrete can start to create these clamshell spaces, as you described. Like why? I mean, what would be like? Why not do like there's some architects that have experimented with a comic book, or creating a narrative, or like a kind of short film. Like where is the limit of self-representation? Why stop here, right? Kind of in the way that exhibition making allowed for you guys, right? And that's to do a project that wouldn't be possible as a kind of building. A book and a publication could also be a site for experimentation. For self-representation as well.
What I found interesting in the presentations, in your descriptions of the book, was, of course, you, as graphic designers and architects often do in this room, you presented its construction, its design, its making, and I guess we just do it as a species. Like, architects really present books like architects.
Right.
You go to an artist's book launch and it's as if the book dropped out of heaven.
Yeah.
It was perfect.
Yeah.
And I'm stunned. I mean, Andy Warhol would talk about that the way in which his books just arrived, like literally from the hand of God. And there wasn't ever a struggle. There certainly wasn't ever a construction project behind it. And in a way, what it is an incredible representation of is also the projects themselves, right? And that this making is in a way a deliberate extension of how you operate within the studio, and that it is simply part of that same realm of how we operate and how we think. And Zach, you haven't said anything on it yet, but I think it does touch also on the question of that quality of the work rather than simply its appearance. It's nowhere in your summaries did you say, well, here's what we think it looks like as a book. Like from the outside, I look at it as a critic and say, God, it's pretty deadpan, and that's interesting to me. I mean, and it is that in my version. I mean, it's a book without serifs. Anything that's going to distract us, it's factual. It's quite direct, and we've had these conversations over the years also here about where we think the state of book space is in architecture. But what I'm interested in how you all present and talk about the project is that its qualities aren't the focus or the topic as much as how it's come about. But at some point you're clearly in control of that also. It's not an accidental arrangement of stuff. In fact, there's great continuity between this and the two thinner volumes from the 3 or 4 years before. And I was wondering, were there conversations around that? Like, did you verbalize it, or did you just get lucky and it all appeared in one form and we liked it and it just went forward? Or why don't you answer that?
No, you answer.
I mean, to compare it, to take it back.
Before we tried to, as far as that, you need to correct me, but we didn't have the atlases in mind when we were starting the book.
Right.
Huh.
They were gone. I mean, they were on the table, but we said we have to do something else. And then all these coffee table, whatever things came up, and we, of course, didn't want to do a coffee table, and where would we start, and whatever. And then we had, and then we were stuck at some point. And I didn't want to do the book after 1.5 years. I mean, I said, forget it, we're not doing it. This is just not the right, I'm not sure if it's the right time. It's just that it doesn't work. We don't need a book, whatever. We have our office brochures. And then we had a lovely friend of ours coming from the DAM Frankfurt, Oliver Elzer, who's a great critic and has done great. And he came in and said, and I said, Oliver, I mean, how should we do this? There were all these panels, and I think it was just like the writer's block situation, where you just couldn't you couldn't see anything anymore, and what do we put in? And everything looked like crap. I mean, the whole office looked like crap, all the work, and it's like, I'm gonna quit and whatever. And then he came in and he saw the, yeah, it was a midlife crisis in the middle. And then he came in and he looked at the atlas and said, what are you talking about? There it is, you have it. I mean, this is it. I mean, you need to continue this. I mean, this is, that was crucial. And maybe you had that in mind, but you didn't. You were too polite to tell us to continue. I don't know, but that was really seriously. That was no. And then we said okay, and then boom, it came together. We knew about the chapters before, but then we were, as you said, then we had more chapters. We then eliminated some chapters, and then we set it up like the atlas in a probably, but in a much more rigorous way. I mean, and then we had, and also what the atlas has. Atlas doesn't have these continuous flows of the text. We have these texts in there now, which was really important. And then the idea, and then what also came is that we asked Ivan Ban, and it wasn't so much because we needed Ivan Ban, like every architect in the world now needs Ivan Ban. It was more that we always had a lot of different photographers looking at our work, which makes it's fantastic if you have these different eyes looking at the work. But I had seen images by him. I had gone to a Herzog de Meuron lecture, and Herzog was showing these images on this huge screen, and these were photos by Ivan, and they were so stunning because you were really drawn into the architecture. And what was also crucial is that he includes people. And architects they're so insane. They think it has to be so clean. There's not one person allowed to go through the picture. There's not supposed to be, which is stupid. I mean, in a way. And for this campus, it was. And then we looked at the campus, and then we had that chapter. And then all of a sudden, after this little crisis, it all came together. But it is really based. I think it is based on the atlases, and there you see, and here you can see really how the graphic is as important as the content. And the text also. I really see it that way. It's not, the architecture is not in the foreground. It's all on the same level. Which I like to work that way anyway. I mean.
But I was really happy with the atlases. I think it was a great way to work. So I think returning to those was a kind of happy point. But I think in terms of the book being something experimental, I think there were more radical iterations of the book and then kind of pulling it back. But I think the idea was to somehow find a balance between the work and how it was presented, so that neither one was overpowering the other. Wasn't simply about showing photographs. At the same time, it wasn't simply allowing a graphic design to somehow become its own conceit in a way in terms of the construction of the book.
But now you got the straight version out, What the next iterations could be like just a book of photographs or fold-out posters.
Well,
the next book?
Yeah, that was the comfort zone of the atlases. Those things were produced like in 2 weeks, so there was a kind of spontaneity about those things that was the crisis about this, that, oh my God, now we're creating this thing, it's become monumental. So you wanted to keep that spontaneity, the fact that we could drop projects in at the last second to produce it. But yeah, it's, we're used to doing things that are quicker, that you kind of put things together. So it is a kind of milestone in terms of a period of work, but I think you work on different projects at different speeds. So,
You want to say, should we take some questions from the audience? Any of you, shall we? Questions, everybody? Book readers, book viewers, anybody? Yeah.
Hello, hi. Not really a question about the book, but I'm curious to know how you met and how the firm started. Did it start with a competition, a commission? Yeah.
We met at the GSD, at the Graduate School of Design. Frank, we overlapped for one semester, and then this was in the 90s, and then in the beginning of 90s, and then Frank went. I had 1 more year to go. Frank went to Cornell, and then somehow we decided that we would stay together, and then we also, both of us, we were 6 years apart. So Frank had a lot of working experience, I didn't, but we were both had in our mind to start our own firm as quickly as possible. And New York wasn't really a possibility in the beginning of the 90s, so we went to Europe via Rome. We spent a year in Rome. I was working in an office, and Frank was teaching for Cornell. And then from there we went to Berlin, because the wall had just like come down just like 2-3 years ago, and we thought this is the place to go. And I had studied there, so it made a lot of sense, and we knew that we would have to go to one place where one of us would speak the language. And that's how it started. And then we started incredibly small projects. We lived in like a place, I mean, that's like a third of that size, with our tables and everything, kitchen and bathroom and everything. Really, really, I mean, it was very small. And then we were got small. We got 2 commissions in Berlin very quickly. We won very quickly a competition for a kindergarten and a youth center, and then started to do competitions. And then at the same time, got all these commissions through Trump, through this, we did all this industrial work, and which is then family. This is my background, and we were really lucky because we could build very early, and a lot. We built a lot of stuff in the first 10 years, and did at the same time competitions, and did very experimental projects like the Biosphere and other projects, and that's how it happened. And it's not easy, always. I mean, but we're still together. But we have broken models. We even had an arm that was broken. No, a hand that was broken at some point. So there's a lot of dynamic tension, we call it. But it's very productive.
It's not so much a question, but it's more just reflecting on what you were saying. If you had your eyes closed, I think it touched on something that Brett said about architects and books. If you had your eyes closed during this presentation, you could have been talking about a piece of architecture, but you're talking about the book. And it's almost, I think that this endless fascination that architects, this relationship that architects have with bookmaking, is that a book is basically a piece of architecture. It has a program, it has a form, it's an artifact, it has a very kind of complex network of people. I think, Zak, you mentioned there were 20 people involved or so. You kind of go, well, it took 3 years. Yeah. It's a piece of architecture. It's super spatial. When you flick through them, the pages, there are different kind of spatial attitudes towards different sections. In the end, I'm sure there must have been long conversations which were like fingertip rubbing of paper and choosing a materiality. There's a binding cloth, there's color. It's basically a piece of architecture, and I think that might be why architects kind of get so engaged with it, and also don't treat it as something that fell out of the sky. That's something that's actually very highly constructed, thought about, and it's a really, I think that the object itself is also a really critical thing, and I think that that's kind of, all of that seems to have the thinking of you guys as architects in the piece, and I think probably many of us as architects somehow relate to that.
Yeah, and then ultimately, collaborative. I mean, we're used to collaborating with structural engineers and energy artists, but to work with Zak somehow to, both resist and to encourage, and so I think those lines of negotiation become quite interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a book that we
and it has use attached to it. It has a whole bunch of readers who you don't know, and all of those things are very familiar themes in a sense.
I was wondering if you thought about an ebook version, just because I've been thinking a lot about, architects, as you said, make sometimes really good books, and books are treated as architectures. But actually, I haven't seen yet the ebook form seems to actually lend itself really well to architecture and to really display architecture in a completely different way. That is not just the juxtaposition of text and images. So I was wondering, if you thought about this, because you seem to be experimenting with the book form with all the atlas and this one. So I was wondering, and also you mentioned that you thought about this book, which I thought was really interesting, together with the website, which also seems to be kind of a new way of thinking about it. So.
Well, I think one point about the website is that it kind of relieves you of a certain burden of what you have to communicate in the book, and it gives you the opportunity to do something that you can only do in a book. And I think that was the approach which we chose, which I don't know that this would necessarily translate to an interesting ebook, because it was very much, you know, as Tom kind of mentioned, using the materiality of the book, you know, how things are printed and laid out, and is very much an object. So it's not a conversation that we had, but I mean, it's definitely a conversation that we're having here at the AA, as I think you know, and it's something that we're, you know, becoming more and more involved in.
There is a conversation though whether, you know, the monograph as a kind of midlife crisis, but also is a monograph itself a kind of historical artifact or whatever. Is that something you really need to do? In the office, we say there's really not even a lot of urgency to publish, because you can release things this way and that way on the internet. Everybody can know what your idea is for a project, and they will respond to it. So there is this kind of credible access. So another conversation would be, is a monograph, we've seen historical ones from Alto to Corbusier, are these things still valid, or are they still important as a kind of artifact beyond their simple or their complex materiality and physicality of the things themselves, but actually that as a kind of thing?
But in a way, this doesn't seem to, I only looked at the book today, so it was kind of fast, but it doesn't seem so much as like a monograph in that sense, as like chronological, and it's, you know, it's interesting, you know, when I mean, I think that format maybe is not so, it's kind of better in a way, no? But I think it's interesting when the work, like a piece of architecture, when it becomes something that's printed in a book, becomes as, you know, on the same level as a text, as an, you know, so that it's not a monograph about necessarily just the work itself as it exists in the real world.
Yeah, and I think, Brett, you were saying also the domino. I mean, it never existed as a fact. It always existed as a kind of publication, and still its sort of currency was vast. I mean, it had so much influence. In a way, this stuff is the opposite. Most of these things are actual facts out in the world that you can go see and you can experience. So is capsulizing these things in you know, a number, you know, 300, 400 pages, you know, it's kind of an index, and maybe that's the ultimate site, non-site discussion, but these things exist out in the world. So the monograph, in a way, is a kind of snapshot of something that's quite different and real, which is almost the opposite of the domino idea, which really never needed to exist as a kind of physical thing. It could simply be the kind of ideation of this thing that would have a kind of impact on a broad spectrum of projects. So that, you know, I think it provokes the question, you know, what is this thing? Is it still valid? You know, I think the renegotiating, the reformatting of it, all that stuff is quite important. But you know, in a way, I don't feel like we need to do another one for another 20 years. So.
Thank you. One more question. Anybody else? Yeah. Here's one. There's one over here too.
Hi. I was wondering, in terms of the content, if there were any pieces of architecture which were previously fitted on another format, which then lend themselves better to fit in the book. Like a competition, for instance, if you'd had something laid out as a competition.
That should go someplace else in a different format?
Pardon?
Like another kind of project that would go into a different format?
Yes,
or?
exactly.
Yeah, like I think Zak's earlier, the Alice's emphasized process material tooling, so which was not, I think, appropriate for the monograph. So I think there's a kind of pushing and pulling. So in different publications, the emphasis changes. So we've also did a book on one project, the Korean. So project. So in that book, it could be exhaustively shown in terms of process, in terms of detail, in terms of engineering. So that's a very different book, you know, just really going into the social, economic, cultural context of that project. So different formats give you different opportunities for framing your work, whether it's specific or it's topical, or if it's about process. So, and I think, and maybe that's the realm of the experimental and bookmaking is that you know, how do you think about, as Carson was sort of hinting at that, but how do you format, or what are other forms of representation or representation of your work which challenges the status quo of how we think books and how we make them?
With that in mind, I mean, Sterling's Black Book is maybe quite an interesting example of where so many of the projects in there were kind of redrawn specifically for publication, and whether, on the one hand, there's a kind of reflection on one's work through, or your work through essay writing and rephotographing, but was there any temptation? I mean, it's a lot of work, but to somehow redraw or rethink or redescribe the projects so that there's a second point of departure, which for Sterling, the Black Book certainly was.
Yeah, no, I'm a great fan of manipulating and reformatting work. Yeah, again, if it helps, you know, isolate the idea or strengthen an idea, I'm a huge fan of that kind of, again, representing the work in terms of it not being literally true to its actual condition, but somehow as a way of hierarchically showing what those features are.
I mean, in a way, you can see the chocolate bar not as a kind of throwaway gift, but as a publication. I mean, you published those chocolate bars in a way, right? And then you can talk about how, you know, the True Tech build, or the Tour Total is a building for an oil company, and there's a certain industry that goes with the, you know, trade of chocolate and cocoa, and I mean, so I think it's a great question, and I think it could be taken really seriously. Like, what are the various forms of publications that could tell, you know, wildly different stories about each project that is not necessarily book form.
But the Black Book, I think, is a really interesting example of, you know, where do you slightly fictionalize things, or again represent the work, other than this idea of, I think you talked about truth of materials, but truth of presentation or representation. Why? I mean, this thing exists in a way, again, it is autonomous to the actual projects that it's depicting, so why not? So there's an idea of selection. What do you select? What do you leave in? What do you edit? But another level could be, again, a kind of representing or idealizing certain projects that has a kind of independence from the actual, you know, dirty realism of slugging these things out on a construction site.
We're doing it for